Welcome. If today is your first time watching this episode, I would encourage you to go back and watch episode or part 1 and part 2 of I Care 101 so that you would have an in-depth understanding of what we are doing. Let's continue from where we left off. We discussed some stages as far as sexual ascent is concerned. We looked at sensory stimulation, the process of stimulating our senses such that they are fed with various contents which directly or indirectly affect us. Then we also spoke about unrestrained actions, where after we've stimulated our senses, this stimulation results in taking action, not being able to restrain our desires. Now, what's next? If we are unable to restrain our desires and we engage in these actions, what's next for the Christian youth? What happens to the Christian youth? Is there any chain of effects? Is there any consequences that Christian youth faces day in and day out as a result of our inability to restrain our actions and our emotions and our desires? Stage 3 of sexual sin will delve into this narrative. We'll be right back. I call stage 3 the devastating consequences. In 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 6 to 26, we witness a chain of effects that unfold after David's sensual stimulation and action. And so after David has stimulated his senses and after David has engaged in the adulterous activity with Bathsheba, there are a series of consequences as a result of his actions. Now, each stage sets in motion a series of events with far reaching consequences that ultimately lead to the destruction of David's life. And so, after David was unable to restrain his emotions and went for another man's wife, there came in a series of challenges, a series of effects. And so in this episode, we are going to discuss some of the effects, some of the challenges, some of the difficulties, some of the devastating consequences of engaging in sexual sin. And we are going to explore these consequences from 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 6 to 26. Now, the narrative reminds us of the destructive power of unchecked desires and the effects they can have on individual lives, the dangers associated with engaging in sexual sin, and how these dangers and how these effects affect the life of the Christian youth. The first effect is what I call the pregnancy effect. The pregnancy effect. Now, sex and sexual relations were created by God. And in Genesis, we realize that God's command, God's instruction to Adam and Eve was that we should multiply. And so, sexual relations in the mind of God was a means for mankind to multiply on the earth. Aside multiplying on the earth, there was also a means for mankind to enjoy. The pregnancy effect is standard. After David's adulterous affair with Bathsheba, we know that there was nothing like a contraceptive there. There was nothing like a condom there. So there was definitely going to be more or less like an unexpected pregnancy. So after David had his affair, then we realized that Bathsheba became pregnant. Now, this pregnant effect revealed the consequences of their actions and presented a moral dilemma for David. The illicit affair had not only violated the sanctity of marriage, but also resulted in an unwanted pregnancy that would further complicate the situation. So, David went to another man's wife, and not only did his actions destroy the sanctity of marriage, it also led in what I call what we see as unwanted pregnancy. Many young people engage in sexual acts and sexual activities and knowing or unknowingly, they end up having a child. They end up conceiving. The woman involved ends up conceiving, and this is one of the most commonest effects or dangers associated in engaging in sexual sin. It puts the young person in a very difficult and complex situation. So let me ask you, are you ready to be a father? Are you ready to be a mom? Is your mother or father not the one taking of you? If so, then David's story with Bathsheba should remind us that these things would definitely lead to consequences, to definitely lead to some effects. And one of the effects is a pregnancy effect. There are so many people who are struggling in life because of pregnancy. For some people, they decide not to abort the baby, they keep the baby, and since they were not prepared for this stage of their life, they go through a series of complications, a series of challenges, a series of emotional trauma that if they had not engaged in this activity, they may not have gone through this effect or this challenge. Now, when pregnancy sets in, then since it's a series of effects or a chain of effects, a chain of consequences, there's what we call the cover-up effect. The cover-up effect. After David had impregnated Bathsheba, he tried to find ways and means to cover up. So, faced with the revelation of Bathsheba's pregnancy, David attempted to cover up his transgression. He summoned Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, back from the battlefield. We know that Uriah was a warrior, and so he was out there on the battlefield. And when David realized that Bathsheba is now pregnant, what he did was that he called Uriah back from the battlefield. Why did David call Uriah back from the battlefield? What was David's intention for calling Uriah back from the battlefield? Probably this was to provide an opportunity for Uriah to sleep with his wife Bathsheba, so that he would be able to conceal the true paternity of the child. And so in an attempt to conceal the true paternity of the child, David then decides to call Uriah back from the battlefield, so that when Uriah comes, Uriah would have an affair with his wife. Then obviously the child would belong to Uriah and not David. However, Uriah's unwavering loyalty to his fellow soldiers and his refusal to enjoy marital privileges while they were still at war thwarted David's plan. And interestingly, Uriah, as a soldier, knew the importance of sharing in that goal, that objective of fighting enemies. And so when Uriah came back from the battlefield after David had called him, he did not have any affair with Bathsheba. In fact, the scripture said that he did not sleep in the room with Bathsheba. And so we always want to cover up the effect of our sins. When pregnancy sets in, we want to cover up with something. We want to cover up with anything we can cover up with. And in an attempt to cover up, we end up doing so many things. We end up lying. We end up giving the pregnancy to someone who is not responsible for the pregnancy. We end up causing divisions. We end up creating so many challenges. Now, aside the cover-up effect, is there any other effect? Yes. The next effect is what I call the murdering effect. So pregnancy sets in, we want to cover up the pregnancy, and in an attempt to cover up the pregnancy, we zoom into the murdering effect. And in David's case, when his initial cover-up plan did not work, his desperation grew, and in a tragic turn of events, he orchestrated Uriah's death by placing him in a position of certain danger on the battlefield. This act of murder not only deepened the web of deceit, but also revealed the extent to which David was willing to go to protect his reputation. In an attempt for David to protect his identity and reputation, he ended up killing Uriah. And for many Christian youths, a number of Christian youths who end up with pregnancy usually commit abortion. For many Christian youths who end up with a pregnancy effect, the usual cover-up effect we employ is abortion in order to cover up for our identity, our reputation as Christian youth, as people of faith. We end up killing babies. We end up murdering the children we've been blessed with. It is true but sad that these pregnancies may be unwanted. However, these babies are gifts. And despite these babies being gifts, we still end up killing them. So, I know a young lady who, as a result of sexual sin, she has committed no less than 3 abortions for one guy. And it's dangerous. Their inability to control their sexual urges led them down a path of 3 different abortions. There's a Christian youth. There's a young lady who is pursuing knowing God, who actually wants to know God and have a relationship with God. 3. And so nobody is condemning anyone. However, it is dangerous. These things can lead to the destruction of the person's womb. These things can lead to several challenges. Sometimes even lead to death of the individual involved. Why would you want to put yourself in that situation? Why would you want to put yourself in a situation where you would lose your life when it's not yet your time? And so the caution we are giving to one another is not because we do not want anyone to enjoy, but we realize that it's essential and it's appropriate that we enjoy within the right time. Because obviously in the right time, we may not go through some of these challenges like the cover-up effect, like murdering effect. If we are married, we may not go through these series of challenges. But when we are not, then we are tempted to cover up, we are tempted to kill these innocent babies. The shame, the guilt, it's unbearable. So guys, let's be mindful. Let's educate one another as far as building a healthy relationship is concerned, as far as sexuality is concerned. And so let's look at this chain of consequences, from pregnancy to covering up, from covering up to murdering this innocent baby. And so after the murdering effect, what's next? We have what we call the shame and guilt effect. Shame is a deep-seated feeling of embarrassment, humiliation, and a diminished sense of self-worth that arises from the recognition of our own wrongdoing. In the case of David, his actions with Bathsheba and the subsequent cover-up led to a profound sense of shame. Though initially driven by desire, the weight of his transgressions bore heavily upon him, ending his inner peace and tarnishing his reputation. And at this point, we are talking about the shame and guilt effect. And so we become shameful as far as what we did is concerned. We are embarrassed. We feel so bad about what we've done. Then there's what we call guilt, which is also an emotional response that arises when we recognize that we have violated our moral values or harmed others. And so emotionally, we are hurt. Emotionally, we feel guilty because we recognize that whatever we did violated our moral values, it's violated our spiritual values.
and we've harmed others. David's guilt was palpable as he became aware of the consequences of his actions. The knowledge that he had committed adultery and also planned the murder of Uriah burdened his conscience, leaving him tormented by remorse and the awareness of his moral failure. Shame and guilt often lead to a sense of isolation and brokenness. In David's case, the shame and guilt he experienced distanced him from his relationship with God and strained his connection with others. The weight of his transgressions left him feeling separated from the source of his spiritual strength and alienated from those he loved, amplifying his sense of brokenness. And so we cover up for our sin, we murder people, we murder these kids, and then there is this shame, there is this guilt we'll be dealing with. In fact, even if the sexual sin does not lead to a pregnancy effect, for a Christian youth, it leads to shame, it leads to guilt. Deep within us, we feel so guilty for violating God's principles as far as sexuality and morality is concerned. So there is what we call the shame and guilt effect. There is also what we call the hardship effect. Now, the chain of effects continue to unfold in David's life. So the death of Uriah had far-reaching consequences as it left Bathsheba widowed and the child conceived from the affair fatherless. However, the child did not survive. The child died. But what we are studying from this section is that God was displeased with David's action, and the prophet Nathan comforted David, and he told him the series of hardship that would come David's way because of his actions, because of his inability to restrain his desires. There would be a series of hardship, a series of challenges that would come David's way. So, having covered up the pregnancy by killing Uriah, then David would also go through several hardships as foretold by the prophet Nathan. The narrative in 2 Samuel chapter 11 serves to remind us of how sensory stimulation and unrestrained action can trigger a chain of effect that can destroy an individual's life. The pursuit of unrestrained desire led David down a path of pain, a path of moral compromise, deceit, and ultimately the destruction of lives and relationships. It serves to remind us, it serves to warn us about the devastating consequences that can unfold when we allow our desires to go unchecked, when we allow sin to crouch into our head, when we allow sin to make us slaves, when we become slaves to sin. There's also what we call the addiction effect. While addiction may not necessarily have been evident in the narrative, while addiction may not be seen in 2 Samuel chapter 2, we know that engaging in these sexual activities can result in a series of wanting more of what you are enjoying. And so the Christian becomes addicted to whatever he or she has exposed him or herself to. Addiction is a complex issue that affects an individual from all walks of life. It often begins with seemingly harmless choices or indulgence that gradually spiral out of control. And in the case of David, his initial act of lust led him down a treacherous path, resulting in a series of escalating actions that brought devastation, that brought destruction, that brought spiritual declination to David's life. Recognizing the addiction stage is crucial for those who find themselves trapped in a cycle of addictive sexual behaviors. It is characterized by the loss of control, compulsive engagement in the behavior despite the negative consequences. and an increasing tolerance that necessitates greater indulgence to achieve the same level of satisfaction. So what we are trying to say is that you realize what you are doing has negative consequences on your life. However, since you are addicted to it, you still want to engage in the act. You still want more of the act, despite the negative consequences, the negative implications the act would have on you. Why? You want the satisfaction you had previously. And so, wanting that satisfaction, you would then want to engage in the action again, you would want to engage in the action again, you would want to engage in the action again. What's the conclusion of this whole chain of effect? The chain of effect we witness in 2 Samuel chapter 11 exposes the destructive power of unchecked desires and the far-reaching consequences they can have on an individual. So, from the initial sensory stimulation to the action stage, to the subsequent pregnancy effect, cover-up effect, murdering effect, and the hardship David went through, it's obvious that it is not worth taking. It's not a journey worth walking on. The narrative prompts us to reflect on the importance of self-control, accountability, and the pursuit of righteousness to avoid being entangled in a destructive chain of events that can lead to distraction, that can lead to suicide, that can lead to several challenges, several dangers, several effects. However, as we end our discussion on the stages of sexual sin, and as we bring our conversation, our discussion on I Care 101 to an end, this is what I want to say. In light of the narrative, in light of 2 Samuel, we are reminded that even in the face of sexual sin, there is hope for redemption and transformation. David's story serves as a powerful testament to the possibility of healing and restoration. Despite the depth of shame and guilt David went through, we still have a channel to go back to God. We still have a path for redemption, a path for transformation. And we shall delve into forging a path of redemption despite our challenges with sex and its related issues. We are going to look at how a young Christian would be able to come out of the shame and guilt and still pursue spirituality, and still pursue wanting to know God, and still pursue trying to build a relationship with God, and still pursue wanting to be pure. Stay tuned. If you like this episode, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more.